Hi everyone, question for you. What's the least satisfying thing you've ever bought? What's the least satisfying thing you've ever spent your money on? And why is that? Maybe in your community group tonight, you'd like to share, or whenever you have it, share with those around you, what's the least satisfying thing you've ever bought? And just work out, why is that? Why was it so satisfying? You know, we kicked around on Sunday, just gone, this idea that Jesus makes generous hearts. Following on from last week, when we saw that God's character, God's very nature is to be generous, we saw that actually we have a problem. We have an issue in our own selves, our inward heart, our inward mind. As humans, we have an inward lean bend towards selfishness, greed, stinginess. And that actually Jesus came to redeem all of us, even that stingy, selfish side, which means only by the grace of God are we able to be truly generous people, made in God's image, reflecting the character and nature of God. And we saw that in 2 Corinthians, really wonderful passage. 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, in fact, all talk about generosity. And Paul's writing to this church who have a generosity problem. They put their hand up really eagerly. We will give to those who need financial assistance in the first century. Came time for Paul to send Titus to gather that money to take it to Jerusalem, and they had cold fingers, their hands closed up, and they said, "Nah, I'm not sure if we're going to give what we decided to." And so Paul writes to them and encourages them, but he doesn't say you should because I'm an apostle. He doesn't say you must because you said you would. He does remind them of that, of course. He doesn't appeal to them to guilt them. He doesn't make them feel bad. He doesn't try to pull any punches with them. You know what he does to motivate them to give? He appeals to Jesus Christ. And he says in 2 Corinthians 8, 2 Corinthians 8, 1-9, he tells them and says, you know two things I want you to know. One, something you don't know. That's, first of all, how God's grace has been working in another church, actually in a whole region of churches in Macedonia, who in fact are so poor at the moment, who are having such a hard trial, they still gave, but not only from what they had, but even more because they gave themselves to the Lord and then to the need. So you need to know that giving isn't actually about how much, it's about your heart, and it's about the ability, not the amount you have. And secondly, look at Jesus, and you know that, don't you? Because he became spiritually poor to make you spiritually rich. Paul talks about poor and rich there in terms of Jesus Christ and his nature, not in his state of life. He was no poorer, Jesus, than any first century Jew. There was beggars around. He wasn't a beggar. He had money to give to those. He was okay in life. He wasn't rich. He wasn't poor. He was just average. And so Paul says, look to Jesus, who became not just economically bad in the world, but actually spiritually poor, leaving aside the glory of heaven to make you spiritually rich. And so he appeals to that and says, from the gospel, think upon who Jesus is and his grace to you so much that it changes your heart from a stingy heart to a generous heart. And actually, that's the way that we become generous, by reflecting on all God has given us in Christ, who God is in his very nature. And how could we not then put our hands in our pockets, put our hands in our time, with our talents, with our energy, with all those things, and say, Lord, it is yours, it belongs to you, do with it what you will. And the hard question that you must be confronted with, all of us, is that our giving directly affects our spiritual health. It sounds interesting, doesn't it? But we can't look at the gospel, at the God who gave himself for us, and turn around and be stingy with what we have, can we? It just doesn't work. It is not compatible. It'll look different, of course, in different times and ways and places. The Macedonians gave far less than the Corinthians could have, given that they were so poor, but they gave themselves to the Lord and then to the cause. And what God's after is not the amount. Oh no, he's after your heart. Which means some of you, to think through, may be able to give far more than what you are. Some of you shouldn't be giving at all, or way less from your stage of life. But as a group, read 2 Corinthians chapter 8, 1-9, kick it around, focus on the two examples Paul gives, focus on Jesus and his grace and what he's done and how Paul motivates them to be generous. So may you be generous, just like our great God has made us to be. Why don't you pray that we will be generous people as a church in our time, talents, and treasures this week. Have a great week. See you next week as we start a new series in Jonah.